Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. We've always thought of the Death Eaters as nothing more than faceless fanatics, obedient slaves to Voldemort's will. But is that truly the case? What if behind those fearsome masks were hidden secret rules, ancient rituals, and even traitors within their ranks? Today we dive into the darkest corners of the wizarding world, where fanatics are born, fates are sealed, and a mark on the skin becomes a seal of loyalty or doom. Ready? Then let's begin. Number 1. How did the Brotherhood of Death Eaters begin? At the heart of the magical world, where the paths of young witches and wizards cross, at Hogwarts, the story of the Death Eaters first took root. Within those ancient walls, a young Tom Riddle began gathering those who would become his loyal and dangerous followers. As Dumbledore reveals in The Half-Blood Prince, Voldemort began recruiting even as a student. These followers didn't just pledge themselves to him, they passed the ideology of darkness on to their families, and later to their children. This was especially potent in Slytherin, where pure blood ideals were treated like heirlooms. In such families, darkness wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. And number 2, when could a young wizard become a Death Eater? Age was never truly a barrier. While most Death Eaters were adults, there are troubling exceptions in history. Draco Malfoy received the Dark Mark between his 5th and 6th years. Regulus Black joined the Dark Lord's ranks and died just as he reached adulthood. Barty Crouch Jr. was barely out of his teens when he was sent to Azkaban. It seems the threshold of 15 or 16 was when young minds were most susceptible to Voldemort's ideology, and when they became truly dangerous. Number 3. How did they avoid Azkaban after Voldemort's fall? When the Dark Lord fell for the first time, it seemed all his followers would be condemned, and yet, most simply, vanished. Why? Some had clever excuses. Lucius Malfoy claimed he'd been under the Imperius curse the whole time. Igor Karkaroff went even further, turning in everyone he could to avoid prison, and Severus Snape was saved by Dumbledore's trust. But there was another path, the one whispered about but rarely spoken aloud: gold. The wealthiest and most influential Death Eaters bought their way to freedom through the pockets of bureaucracy. Number 4. Did they have an internal hierarchy? Yes. Though the Death Eaters may have seemed chaotic, they followed a clear structure. At the top, Voldemort. Below him, the inner circle: Bellatrix Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, and other trusted lieutenants. Next came the field Death Eaters, those who led attacks on the Ministry and carried out missions. Beneath them were the branded but less active members. Below them, sympathizers, not officially marked, but loyal in action. And finally, those who wanted to belong, but were never fully trusted. They were kept at arm's length, in reserve. Number 5. Who was Peter Pettigrew, really? Wormtail is one of the most contradictory figures in the saga. He betrayed the Potters, helped resurrect Voldemort, and returned to him in a critical moment. His contributions were undeniable. And yet, among the Death Eaters, he was never respected. He was scorned. Even after receiving his silver hand, he was never trusted with anything important again. In Voldemort's army, loyalty didn't guarantee status. Peter was useful, but pitiful. Number 6. What does the Dark Mark truly hold? The mark wasn't just a symbol, it was a connection, a brand. Voldemort could summon his Death Eaters with a mere touch to his own mark, and they, in turn, felt his power. The stronger he grew, the darker the tattoo burned. It was a beacon, a warning, a curse, a symbol of their dependence on him. When he disappeared, the mark faded. When he returned, it blazed. Number 7. Why did some receive the mark despite being a risk? Snape, Pettigrew, Draco, they were all branded, even though their loyalty was uncertain. Why? Most likely it was a form of control. With the mark you couldn't run, you couldn't hide, you were forever marked as a servant of the dark. Even if you betrayed him, the mark would remain. It was a symbol of allegiance and a shackle. Number 8. How many Death Eaters did Harry meet before the Goblet of Fire? Though the term Death Eater only appears later in the books, Harry had been encountering them from the very beginning. Quirrell, Snape, Lucius Malfoy, Peter Pettigrew, McNair. These names lurked in the shadows. Only later did their true identities come to light. Voldemort was always close, even when he seemed gone. Number 9. What happens to a Death Eater's family if they fail? Failure didn't end with you, not under Voldemort. If you fell, your family fell too. That was the rule. Break it, and watch your blood pay the price. Lucius Malfoy made one mistake, just one. He gave the diary to a girl. It was destroyed, the Horcrux lost. Voldemort said nothing, but he moved in, took their home, took their pride, turned Malfoy Manor into his throne room. Draco became a message. "Kill Dumbledore," Voldemort whispered. It wasn't a reward, it was a death sentence. Draco was 16, shaking, silent, but he couldn't say no. His mother watched. Her hands trembled. She knew, if he failed, she'd lose him. Maybe her life too. Narcissa begged Snape, made the unbreakable vow because no one else could save her son, not her husband, not her name, not her blood, just a promise sealed in magic and fear. Even Bellatrix, mad with loyalty, saw her sister suffer. She said nothing. Loyalty didn't protect family, not with Voldemort, not ever. Azkaban was full of wives and brothers, names forgotten, lives thrown away. They weren't guilty, they were close. That was enough. Number 10. Were there women among the Death Eaters? There were women among the Death Eaters, not many. But the ones who joined were unforgettable. They weren't shadows, they were fire, sharp, loud, merciless. Bellatrix Lestrange led the charge. She didn't serve, she worshipped. She laughed as she killed. "You need to mean it," she hissed at Harry. She always meant it. Every curse, every scream. Even the others feared her. Even Voldemort. She wasn't loyal. She was his fanatic. Alecto Carrow came next, cold, bitter. She taught at Hogwarts, if you could call it teaching. She punished. She preached hate. She made students bleed. Children cried when she entered the room. She called it discipline. It was cruelty, plain and simple. Others worked in silence. Narcissa Malfoy walked the edge. No mark, but close. Close enough to feel the heat. She lied to Voldemort to protect Draco. "Is he alive?" she asked Harry. One whisper, one lie, it saved everything. The women didn't need numbers, they didn't ask for power. They took it. When they moved, the ground shook. They weren't Death Eaters, they were storms, and no one stood in their way. Number 11. What was the initiation ritual to become a Death Eater? No one talked about it, no one dared. The initiation into the Death Eaters was a shadow, felt, not seen. No rules, no scrolls, just fear, just blood, just him. Voldemort watched every step, cold, still, like a god judging his creation. You didn't just kneel, you offered your soul, and if he didn't like what he saw, you died before the ceremony ended. The mark came next, black, burning, alive. It crawled into your skin, left more than a scar. It throbbed when he called, burned when he was near, a leash disguised as a gift. Then came the test, something cruel, something final. Kill, torture, destroy, a muggle, a traitor, a friend. It didn't matter, you did it, or you didn't walk away. That was the real vow, one act so dark you could never come back from it. Bellatrix didn't flinch, she laughed. Dolohov followed, silent, deadly, but not all passed. Some hesitated. Regulus Black took the mark, took the test, then broke, tried to undo what he'd done. Voldemort made sure he didn't live long enough to warn anyone. It was never held in the same place twice, sometimes a ruined manor, sometimes a graveyard, once. Deep in the forest where no light touched the trees, but always it was quiet, no cheering, just silence, just pain. No one ever spoke of what happened, even among themselves. It was the rule behind the rules. Your crime was your bond, your shame was your silence. That's how Voldemort owned them, not with threats, with memory. When the mark burned into your skin, you weren't just a follower, you were erased, whatever you were before. Son, brother, student. It vanished. The old you died. What stood in your place belonged to him. Number 12. Were there spies or double agents among the Death Eaters? There were spies, liars, masks beneath masks. Voldemort demanded loyalty, but trusted no one. He ruled with fear, watched everyone, listened for cracks. The smallest tremble could mean death. Severus Snape played the deepest game. Death Eater, teacher, double agent, maybe the best who ever lived. Voldemort trusted him. Dumbledore trusted him. Neither knew everything, but Snape did, and he walked the tightrope alone. He gave Voldemort what he needed, enough truth to survive, enough silence to hide. But it was Dumbledore he served, always, because of Lily, the only thing he ever loved. "Look at me," he whispered, dying, still chasing her eyes. Karkaroff was weaker, a rat in robes. When Voldemort fell, he broke. He stood before the Wizengamot and named names like Candy, Mulciber, Travers, Rosier. He begged for mercy, got it, for a while, but Voldemort remembered. He always remembered. Karkaroff died alone, throat cut, dark marks scorched on the ceiling above him. There were others, shadows, a werewolf who whispered secrets, a clerk in the ministry who passed files in the night. No glory, no names, just quiet hands, changing everything. Voldemort knew betrayal would come. That's why he split his soul. That's why he kept his secrets buried deep. He never told anyone the whole truth, not even Bellatrix, especially not Lucius. After the diary, he was done with trust. Inside the Death Eater ranks it was poison, eyes behind every back, words weighed like gold, a wrong pause, a glance, a breath, and you disappeared. No one asked, no one cried. The dark mark faded. Another lesson. In the end, it wasn't a wand that killed him. It was memory, a tear, a truth, Snape's truth, given to the boy he hated most, and that truth shattered everything Voldemort had built, from the inside, just like he feared. Number 13. Why didn't some pure-blood families join the Death Eaters? Not all pure-bloods bowed. Some refused, loudly, publicly, and paid the price. Voldemort promised unity, power, purity, but not everyone wanted it. Not everyone believed the lie. The Weasleys didn't flinch. Pure-bloods, yes, but blood meant nothing to them. Arthur loved Muggles, worked with them, defended them. Molly stood just as firm. They raised 7 children to fight, not follow. They were mocked. "Blood traitors," hissed Lucius Malfoy. But the Weasleys didn't care. They wore the insult like a badge. Ron stood by Harry. Always. Fred and George laughed in the face of fear. Ginny joined the resistance before she finished school. Percy stumbled, blinded by ambition, but even he came back. The Weasleys chose the order, chose war, chose what was right. They became targets. The burrow was attacked. Arthur nearly died from a snake bite. Death Eaters watched their every move, but they kept going. No dark mark, no surrender, just fire and love and stubborn courage. The Longbottoms fought too, Frank and Alice, brave to the end. They faced Bellatrix Lestrange and didn't break until she broke their minds. Torture stole their memories, their names, but not their honor. Other families stayed silent, not because they were cowards, because they were sickened. Voldemort's cruelty was too much. Killing children, torturing Muggles, they wanted no part of it. So they vanished, hid, fled the war in shame or fear, but even silence had a price. Saying no wasn't safe. It was a challenge, a dare. Refusing the dark mark meant death, or worse. Families lost homes, names, futures. Voldemort made sure of that. Join or be hunted, that was the law. Number 14, were there rules even Death Eaters couldn't break? There were rules, unspoken, unbreakable, carved in fear. Loyalty came first. Not just loyalty, worship, total surrender. A single doubt and you were dead. No questions, no trial, just a curse to the chest. Regulus Black found out. He wore the mark, called Voldemort Master, but he saw the truth, the Horcrux, the lies. So he stole the locket, fed it to a lake full of inferi. He knew what would happen. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He vanished. Chose death before betrayal could be discovered. The Horcruxes were sacred, off limits, not to be named, not even whispered. Bellatrix guarded one. Lucius held another. Neither knew what they were protecting. Voldemort told them nothing. That wasn't trust. It was power. Secrets gave him control. Ignorance kept them weak. Lucius broke the rule. He used the diary, gave it to a child, let it be destroyed. Voldemort was furious, his voice like ice. "You have disappointed me, Lucius." From that moment, Lucius was out. Not officially, but the looks changed, the trust vanished. He had touched what was forbidden, and he paid. Leaving was impossible. The dark mark wasn't ink. It was a shackle, magical, eternal. No one just walked away, not without a grave waiting, not even with ministry protection. Igor Karkaroff tried. He named names, escaped, hid. A year later, they found him, frozen, marks still burning on his corpse, a message in blood and snow. The Death Eaters didn't need Voldemort to punish traitors. They did it themselves, like predators. They watched, listened, waited. When Travers hesitated during a mission, Bellatrix struck him hard. "You dare tremble?" she snarled. That was the law. Fear nothing, or die trying. Number 15. Who was the most loyal Death Eater? She moved like fire, wild, unstoppable. Bellatrix Lestrange wasn't just a Death Eater. She was Voldemort's fury made flesh. Others followed. She worshipped. While some feared him, she adored him. Not in secret, not in whispers. Loudly, proudly, with every curse she cast. She killed Sirius Black with a laugh. "I killed Sirius Black," she screamed, her voice dancing through the chaos of the Department of Mysteries. It wasn't regret, it was triumph. She murdered her own cousin for Voldemort, not because he asked, because she wanted to. She was more than a follower, she was trusted. Bellatrix knew about the Horcrux hidden in her Gringotts vault. Voldemort never shared such secrets, not with Lucius, not with Dolohov, not even with Snape, only her. He gave her part of his soul. That meant everything. Her madness had purpose. In Malfoy Manor, she carved into Hermione's arm without flinching. She needed answers. She needed to protect her master. Pain didn't matter. Mercy didn't exist. Just loyalty. Twisted, violent, absolute loyalty. He trusted her in ways he trusted no one else. In the final battle, she didn't hide behind him. She stood beside him, like an equal. "Come," he said softly, and she came. Not like a soldier, like a chosen one. There was something dark between them, something unspoken. Bellatrix didn't want power. She wanted him to have it. She didn't fear death. She feared his disappointment. That made her deadly. More than fanatical, more than cruel. She was devoted, entirely, desperately, forever. Number 16. Did any Death Eaters regret their actions? In the shadows of Voldemort's reign, where fear reigned and cruelty was worn like armor, there were moments, rare and hidden, when doubt slipped through the cracks. Not every Death Eater was a heartless servant of darkness. Behind the masks and the tattoos, some bore scars of regret, and none showed this more tragically than Regulus Arcturus Black, the the younger brother of Sirius. Born into the noble house of Black, Regulus was raised with all the pure-blood pride that shaped many of Voldemort's earliest followers. He was taught that blood was destiny, that purity was power, and he believed it, at least at first. Regulus was only 16 when he joined the Death Eaters, swept away by the grandeur and authority of the Dark Lord. He was ambitious, talented, and eager to make his mark. "My brother is a better son than me," Sirius once said bitterly. "He joined the Death Eaters when he was 16. To Sirius, this was the final betrayal, but Regulus didn't see it that way. To him, Voldemort offered purpose, a cause that mirrored the doctrine he'd been raised on. He thought he was defending something sacred, but the illusion shattered quickly. It wasn't just the violence. He could stomach that, as most could, in Voldemort's inner circle. What Regulus could not accept was the betrayal of his ideals. When Voldemort began using his own followers, sacrificing them without a thought, experimenting on them as if they were no more than beasts, Regulus's loyalty began to crack. The moment of awakening came when Kreacher, the Black family's loyal house elf, was used in one of Voldemort's twisted experiments. The Dark Lord needed someone to test the defenses around one of his Horcruxes, and he chose Kreacher. The Dark Lord did not tell Kreacher what the potion was for, the elf later told Harry. He made Kreacher drink every drop, and Kreacher suffered greatly. Voldemort left the elf to die, but Kreacher didn't die. He returned, because Regulus had told him to come back. When Regulus learned the truth, he was shaken to the core. This wasn't noble, this wasn't power, this was cruelty disguised as ideology. And in that moment, the mask Regulus wore began to fall. He saw Voldemort not as a savior of the pure blood world, but as a tyrant who fed on the loyalty of his followers, only to discard them when convenient. Regulus understood that he had made a terrible mistake. But unlike many, he did not simply retreat into fear or self-loathing. He chose action. Quietly, without drama, without applause, he planned a rebellion of one. He discovered the secret of the Horcrux, the hidden fragments of Voldemort's soul. He did what few dared to even think. He tried to undo the Dark Lord's magic. He told no one, not even his family. He said to Kreacher that the Dark Lord must not win, the elf recalled, voice trembling. Regulus had found the locket hidden in the cave surrounded by enchantments and poison, and decided to take it. He left behind a false one, with a note inside that read, "To the Dark Lord, I know I will be dead long before you read this." This was not just regret. This was redemption, written in pain and sacrifice. Regulus drank the potion himself, fully knowing it would weaken him beyond escape. Kreacher tried to save him, but Regulus was dragged under the black waters by the Inferi, undead guardians of the cave. He died alone, without glory, remembered only as a traitor to Voldemort and a fool by his family. But he had done what few Death Eaters ever dared. He turned against the darkness from within. His story was never told to the Order. Not even Dumbledore knew the full truth. To most of the world, Regulus Black remained a footnote, a young man who died young, corrupted by the wrong side. But when Harry finally held the real locket, when he heard Kreacher's story, a new truth emerged. Regulus Black died trying to bring Voldemort down, Harry said quietly. He was a hero. But Regulus was not the only one who faltered. Others, too, felt the sting of remorse, though few dared to speak of it. Draco Malfoy, for all his arrogance and cruelty at Hogwarts, was not made for murder. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore saw it clearly. "You are not a killer, Draco," he said, standing calmly at the edge of the tower. And Draco, pale and shaking, lowered his wand. Draco had been given an impossible task: to kill Dumbledore, It was meant to be a punishment disguised as an honor. The Dark Lord knew the boy would fail. He intends me to do it in the end, Snape told Bellatrix, referring to the murder. But Draco tried anyway. He let Death Eaters into the castle. He placed a cursed necklace. He poisoned a bottle of mead. And yet each attempt was hesitant, clumsy, incomplete. Because Draco, unlike Bellatrix or the Carrows, still had a conscience. "I have to do this," he said, eyes hollow. But even then he couldn't finish the job. It was Snape who struck the killing blow, and Draco who stood there, frozen, a child caught in a war he didn't choose. Later, at Malfoy Manor, he refused to identify Harry to Voldemort. It was a small act of defiance, but a significant one. Regret had settled in. Fear had stripped away the glamour of darkness. Even Narcissa Malfoy, a woman loyal to her family above all else, committed a silent act of rebellion. In the forest, when Harry pretended to be dead, she was the one who confirmed it to Voldemort. "Is Draco alive?" she whispered. When Harry nodded, she told the Dark Lord he was dead. She lied. For a Death Eater, lying to Voldemort was treason. But Narcissa didn't care. She chose her son over her master. That, too, was a kind of regret for ever letting him into their lives. Number 17. Could Death Eaters produce a Patronus? In the gloomy corridors of the Department of Mysteries, where shadows crept like smoke and whispers, lingered long after voices had gone silent, one might have imagined a silver doe gliding through the darkness. But to conjure a Patronus there, to summon such purity and light, required something the Death Eaters were rarely known for: hope. The Patronus charm is one of the most difficult spells in the wizarding world. It requires not just magical skill, but an inner light, a memory so powerful and joyous it can burn through the deepest fear. As Remus Lupin once explained, the Patronus is a kind of positive force, a projection of the very things that the Dementor feeds upon: hope, happiness, the desire to survive. But could a Death Eater, a servant of Voldemort soaked in cruelty and darkness, ever produce such a charm? To answer that, we must look at the heart of what a Death Eater is. Bellatrix Lestrange, for instance, with her mad laughter and sadistic delight, lived for destruction. Her love, if one could call it that, was for Voldemort, and it was obsessive, twisted, a mirror of her broken mind. There are no joyful memories in her, only domination, fear, and power. The very idea of her conjuring a silvery animal made of hope seems absurd. Her soul, marred by Azkaban and her own thirst for cruelty, lacked the warmth that could feed such magic. Lucius Malfoy offers another telling example. Polished, cold, always composed, Lucius wielded power not with joy but with arrogance. Even when the Malfoys dined in grandeur at their manor, beneath the crystal chandeliers and portraits of scowling ancestors, there was no warmth, only control. Would Lucius ever conjure a Patronus to protect others? Unlikely. Even when Voldemort took up residence in Malfoy Manor, turning their sanctuary into a lair of fear, Lucius cowered more than he resisted. Whatever joy he once knew had long been buried beneath ambition. And yet, among the ranks of these dark wizards, there was one exception, a man cloaked in shadows but lit, secretly, by a single memory. Severus Snape, cold and sharp-tongued, walked a line between good and evil so fine that even Dumbledore had to squint. But within him burned something that not even Voldemort could understand: love. Snape's Patronus was a doe, the same as Lily Potter's. It was the symbol of his unyielding devotion, the memory of a girl who once sat beside him under the trees at Spinner's End, laughing, smiling, before the world took everything from them. His Patronus was not a product of general happiness, but of a singular, all-consuming emotion. When Dumbledore asked him, "After all this time?" "Snape," simply replied, "Always." That moment, more than any other, showed the power of a memory not bound to joy but to a love so deep it became sacred. Snape's ability to produce a Patronus proves it wasn't utterly impossible for a Death Eater. But he was no ordinary follower. He turned spy, betrayed Voldemort, and spent years risking his life to protect the son of the woman he loved. It's important to note that Snape's Patronus was not a weapon. It was a message. He used it to guide Harry to the sword of Gryffindor. He used it to keep her memory alive. It wasn't about defense, it was about remembrance. Compare that to someone like Barty Crouch Jr., who impersonated Mad-Eye Moody with terrifying precision. Barty was clever, passionate, even charismatic, but entirely unhinged. The kind of happiness he felt came from chaos, not kindness. He might have laughed when fooling the entire school for a year, but that laughter lacked the soul that fuels a Patronus. There is no record, in books or in whispers, of Crouch producing one. Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf who revelled in spreading his curse, wouldn't even understand the concept. He hunted children, not dementors. The things that haunt others gave him joy. His darkness was not reluctant or inherited. It was chosen, fed, nurtured. A Patronus from Greyback would be an abomination, and thankfully never seen. But even among the Death Eaters we must consider nuances. Narcissa Malfoy, for example, was never branded with the dark mark, though she shared her family's beliefs. And yet she lied to Voldemort to save her son. "Is Draco alive?" she asked Harry, her voice trembling, and when he said yes, she turned away from the Dark Lord's cause. Could such maternal love form the base of a Patronus? Perhaps, in another life. But Narcissa never showed such magic, and if it existed within her, it remained buried, overshadowed by fear and survival. Draco Malfoy, too, stands at the edge. A boy raised to believe in blood purity, forced to become a killer before he'd even grown into a man. During The Half-Blood Prince, he walks the halls of Hogwarts with sunken eyes and shaking hands. He tries to fix the vanishing cabinet, not with excitement, but desperation. When faced with the task of killing Dumbledore, he cannot do it. The darkness of the Death Eaters is in him, but so is doubt. Still, Draco never conjures a Patronus. Perhaps he could have, if given more time, more healing. But during the war, he was still too broken. From the books, we learn that the Patronus is deeply tied to identity. Harry's is a stag, like his father. Hermione's is an otter, playful and curious. Ron's is a Jack Russell Terrier, loyal and fierce. These aren't just animals, they're reflections of the soul. The idea that a Death Eater could conjure a Patronus suggests a light within them, a part untouched by Voldemort. But how many of them had that? Dumbledore himself believed in redemption. He once told Harry, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." In that sense, a Death Eater who turned away, who chose love over power, might indeed find the strength to conjure a Patronus, but it would not come from joy. It would come from pain transformed. Number 18. Why didn't Voldemort forgive failure? Of all the dark rulers to rise in the wizarding world, Lord Voldemort was perhaps the most ruthless and terrifying. His cruelty extended beyond his enemies. He reserved some of his harshest punishments for his own followers. The Death Eaters who bore his mark and pledged their lives to his cause lived in constant fear of their master. Mistakes were not tolerated. Failure, even when accidental or unavoidable, was repaid with pain, humiliation, and often death. But why did Voldemort rule this way? Why did he choose fear over loyalty, punishment over compassion? The answer begins with Voldemort's own twisted view of power. To him, power was absolute control. Love, mercy, or understanding were weaknesses to be despised. From the moment Tom Riddle began to explore the dark arts at Hogwarts, he believed fear was the only tool that truly worked. "There is no good and evil," he once told Professor Quirrell. "There is only power, and those too weak to seek it." This belief became the foundation of his rule. The Death Eaters were not comrades or trusted advisors. They were tools, pawns to be used and discarded. One of the earliest examples of Voldemort's mercilessness comes from the First Wizarding War. When Barty Crouch Jr., Bellatrix Lestrange, and 2 others were captured after torturing the Longbottoms into madness, Voldemort did not reward them for their loyalty. They had been caught, and that was failure. While Bellatrix remained fiercely loyal, clinging to the belief that the Dark Lord would return and reward her, Voldemort never showed gratitude. In fact, he considered those captured or imprisoned in Azkaban weak. To him, being caught meant being unworthy. Voldemort's view of loyalty was transactional. He expected absolute obedience and perfect execution of his orders. When Lucius Malfoy failed to retrieve the prophecy at the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort's response was immediate and brutal. "You have failed me," he said coldly, in the Ministry's atrium. After that, Lucius was no longer trusted. His position within the ranks crumbled. Voldemort took over the Malfoy household, used it as his headquarters, and humiliated Lucius by giving his precious wand to another. The once proud patriarch became a trembling shell of himself. The message was clear: failure is weakness, and weakness is intolerable. This behavior wasn't mere cruelty for cruelty's sake. Voldemort's punishment of his followers was a calculated strategy. He believed that only fear could keep people in line. If they were terrified of the consequences, they would try harder, move faster, and hesitate less. It was not just a means of control, it was a performance. Every punishment was a reminder to the others: displease the Dark Lord, and you will suffer. When Rookwood brought him false information about the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort killed him in front of the others. It wasn't about Rookwood, it was about the lesson. Even Severus Snape, who Voldemort viewed as one of his most valuable assets, was not safe. When Snape questioned whether Harry Potter should be killed immediately, Voldemort corrected him sharply, and with icy politeness, a tone more dangerous than any curse. The smallest challenge to his plans was an insult to his authority. Trust did not exist in Voldemort's world. Suspicion and fear were the glue that held his followers together. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps his most devoted servant, was often spared the worst punishments, but even she was not immune to his wrath. When she failed to capture Harry at the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort's anger was barely contained. "You disappoint me," he hissed later. Bellatrix wept at his feet, begging for forgiveness, not because she feared death, but because she feared losing his favor. To her, Voldemort was a god, yet even gods in his world showed no mercy. The culture of fear Voldemort created had consequences. The Death Eaters did not act out of love or shared vision, they acted because they were terrified. This made them paranoid, secretive, and ultimately disloyal. Peter Pettigrew, who had once risked everything to help Voldemort return to power, died by his own silver hand, a gift from the Dark Lord, because of a moment's hesitation in obeying. Voldemort had enchanted the hand to kill him if he ever showed weakness. That kind of loyalty insurance was not sustainable. Even the Carrows, who delighted in punishing Hogwarts students during the Dark Lord's reign, lived in dread of failure. They weren't passionate about the cause, they were brutal out of fear. Fear was infectious in Voldemort's ranks. One misstep could lead to torture. One delay in answering a summons could mean death. Every meeting in the Dark Lord's presence was a game of survival. The longer you stood in silence, the more likely you were to become the next target. During the final battle at Hogwarts, Voldemort's unforgiving nature reached its peak. When Harry sacrificed himself and Voldemort believed he had won, he gave his followers one last chance: submit or die. Even then, loyalty was demanded under threat. When Narcissa Malfoy lied to Voldemort about Harry being dead, she did it not out of defiance, but desperation, to reach her son. Her lie was only possible because she no longer feared Voldemort more than she loved her child. That crack in the wall of fear was the beginning of his undoing. Voldemort's inability to forgive mistakes had a deeper root. He feared being seen as weak. In his mind, mercy equaled vulnerability. As a boy in the orphanage, Tom Riddle learned that people could be controlled through fear, and he never abandoned that lesson. Even when he was restored to his body, surrounded by his most faithful, he made an example of anyone who had doubted or left him. "I see you, Lucius. I see your wife has not returned," he said, with cold disdain. His punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Number 19. What happened to the Death Eaters after Voldemort's fall? The final scream of Lord Voldemort had barely faded into the dawn mist when the remnants of his army began to splinter. The Battle of Hogwarts had ended not with ceremony but with silence, broken only by the distant wails of grief and the slow steps of survivors among the ruins. For the Death Eaters, those who once walked proudly behind the Dark Lord in midnight robes, the future shattered like the castle stones around them. Some died where they stood, caught in the last moments of battle. Bellatrix Lestrange, the most fanatical and unhinged among them, was struck down by Molly Weasley in a duel that echoed with rage and maternal fury. "Not my daughter, you bitch!" Molly had cried, and with a jet of light ended the madness that had burned in Bellatrix's eyes for years. Others, less devoted, fled the instant the dark mark in the sky began to fade, their loyalty as transient as power itself. Ministry officials arrived hours later, not as saviors, but as sweepers of war. Auras, hardened by months of rebellion, moved through the rubble identifying bodies, separating the dead from the disguised. One by one they found the known faces: Antonin Dolohov, bruised and bloodied, lying unconscious beneath a fallen column; Augustus Rookwood, his robes torn and his wand snapped, hiding beneath the collapsed remains of the astronomy tower. They were dragged into custody and bound by magical chains that shimmered with blue runes of suppression. But not all the Death Eaters met justice on the battlefield. Many had vanished into the chaos, using the last of their magic to disapparate into the countryside. Among them was Thorfinn Rule, whose heavy hands had tortured countless Muggleborns during Voldemort's regime. He was last seen vanishing into the Forest of Dean, pursued by 3 auras and never found again. Rumours would place him years later in Albania, then in the slums of Nocturne Alley, but the truth remained elusive. The Malfoy family's fate became a subject of immediate controversy. Narcissa Malfoy, who had lied to Voldemort about Harry's death to protect her son, Draco, stood quietly at the gates of Hogwarts when the dust settled. Lucius, pale and defeated, did not speak a word as he was taken in for questioning. But it was Draco, standing beside his mother, his eyes darting between the ruins and the survivors, who became a symbol of conflicted legacy. Despite his prior service to Voldemort, the Malfoys avoided Azkaban. Their cooperation with the Ministry during the final hours of the war, and Narcissa's act of mercy, spared them a prison sentence. They were never truly loyal, Kingsley Shacklebolt reportedly said during the inquiry. They followed fear, not conviction. In the weeks that followed, the wizarding world entered an era of reckoning. Trials were held daily at the newly reformed Wizengamot. Evidence was gathered, memories reviewed, and names spoken aloud in a courtroom that often echoed with screams and sobs. Walden McNair, once the executioner of magical beasts, stood defiantly in chains, sneering as his sentence was read, "Life in Azkaban." His wand, once stained with the blood of unicorns and centaurs, was snapped in front of him. A few attempted to plead ignorance. Travers claimed he had been imperious throughout the war. "I never had a choice," he told the courtroom, but his memory told otherwise. The pensive revealed scenes of brutality, of him leading raids, torturing captives. The sentence came swiftly. The truth, in silver wisps of memory, was impossible to deny. Still, the ministry knew that not all Death Eaters had been caught. Some had vanished entirely. Names like Mulciber, Jugson, and Selwyn whispered in the hallways of the Aura Department like ghosts. It was said that a new task force was formed under Harry Potter's recommendation, composed of elite Auras and curse-breakers, to pursue these remnants. "We're not done," Harry had said, according to eyewitnesses. "There are still shadows out there. We have to find them." Some tried to rebuild. Alecto Caro, who had once ruled Hogwarts with cruelty and punishments, was discovered a year later in a remote Welsh village, working under an assumed name. Her disguise failed when a child recognized her from a Hogwarts photograph. The villagers turned on her before the Auras arrived. She was sentenced to 30 years in Azkaban, her face a permanent mask of hatred and disbelief. Others simply disappeared. Rabastan Lestrange, brother of the infamous Rodolphus, was last seen boarding a ship to the North Sea under a false identity. It is believed he drowned during a storm, but no body was ever recovered. The sea, it seemed, had taken what Azkaban could not. Not all stories ended in punishment. Some Death Eaters, having burned their arms to remove the dark mark, claimed to have renounced their past. Reginald Cresswell, a lesser-known follower, presented evidence of sabotaging the Snatcher's operations from within. His testimony helped convict others, and he was granted freedom under supervision. But the stigma lingered. He was never offered work again and lived the rest of his days in self-imposed exile in the Shetland Islands. The children of Death Eaters bore scars invisible to the world. Scorpius Malfoy, Draco's son, would later confess in The Cursed Child how heavy the burden of his surname had become. "People look at me and see the war," he told Albus Potter. "But I was born after it. I never chose any of it. Their generation inherited a world cleansed of Voldemort, but stained by memory. Azkaban itself changed. The Dementors, once the silent wardens of the prison, were removed under Shacklebolt's reforms. Human guards took their place, and a new division was created to handle cases of magical rehabilitation. Some Death Eaters, like Avery and Knott, attempted to participate in these programs, but the sincerity of their repentance remained questioned. "Evil that deep doesn't vanish with time," said Hermione Granger in a post-war interview. "But if we deny them a chance to change, what does that say about us?" Yet, among the ruins of Voldemort's legacy, a darker whisper survived, the belief that his ideals had not died with him. In the shadowy corners of Wizarding Europe, fringe groups began to rise, echoes of the Death Eaters, but rebranded, secretive, and scattered. They called themselves the True Wands, the Pure Flame, and other names lost to time. Whether they were real or imagined, the fear remained. "History doesn't sleep," said Ron Weasley once. "It just hides under the bed." Years later, Harry would meet one of them. A man named Ignatius Burke, a distant relative of the Borgin and Burkes line, attempted to assassinate Hermione during a conference in Paris. Under Veritaserum, he confessed to being part of a surviving cell of Death Eaters. "We were told to wait," he said, "to sleep until the next dark rises." He was sentenced to life in Nurmengard. The magical world learned a hard lesson from the war. Evil doesn't vanish with victory. It festers in forgotten minds, in unspoken grief. The Aura Office remained ever vigilant, and Harry, though reluctant, never truly left the role. "You don't stop being a soldier because the war is over," he told Ginny one night. "You just change battlefields." The Death Eaters, once so feared, became case studies in wizarding schools, their names listed beside crimes, their faces shown as warnings. But some argued against this. "We make them legends by teaching them," a Hogwarts professor once argued. "Let's teach the victims instead, the names of the fallen, the ones who fought." Still, curiosity never dies. Tomes were written about the war, darkness within, the serpent's mark, the rise and fall of the Death Eaters, some glorified, others condemned, but none denied their impact. "They nearly broke us," Kingsley Shacklebolt said at the 5-year memorial, "but in the end they taught us what not to become." And so the story of the Death Eaters didn't end at Hogwarts. It fractured into trials, escapes, redemptions, and deaths. Some vanished into myth, others into prison cells. But all of them, in one way or another, paid the price of choosing Voldemort's path. For the dark mark, though faded, never truly disappeared. It lingered not on the skin but in memory. Number 20. Why did Voldemort assign Draco Malfoy such a crucial task? When Voldemort summoned Draco Malfoy, the boy had no idea his life would split into two before and after. Just 16, fresh from the disaster at the Department of Mysteries, Draco was about to be handed a task that chilled the blood of even the most hardened Death Eaters. "You are to kill Albus Dumbledore," Voldemort had said in a voice that tolerated no questioning. It was not a request, it was a verdict, both for Draco and for the Malfoy family. But the truth beneath the order ran deeper than any of them realized. To understand this decision, we must first rewind to the Department of Mysteries. Lucius Malfoy, a favored Death Eater, had led the operation to retrieve the prophecy. It ended in catastrophe. The prophecy was lost. Several Death Eaters were captured. Worse, Voldemort himself had to emerge from the shadows, exposing his return to the entire wizarding world. The Dark Lord was enraged. Lucius had failed him, publicly, humiliatingly. But Voldemort didn't scream. He didn't kill Lucius outright. He chose something far more cruel, to make his failure a lesson. Assigning Draco the impossible mission was Voldemort's way of wielding vengeance with surgical precision. He would not merely punish Lucius, he would make the entire Malfoy family squirm under the weight of fear and guilt. He would give them something they could not succeed at and then watch them crumble. As Bellatrix Lestrange put it in Half-Blood Prince, "He's just a boy," when Narcissa pleaded for her son's life. But Voldemort, in his cold disdain, saw only a tool, a pawn. "Perhaps your son will prove to be more competent than you have been, Lucius," he had sneered. Voldemort never truly intended for Draco to succeed. He had Severus Snape as his fallback. But Draco didn't know that. Neither did his mother. That was part of the torment. Draco was handed a loaded wand and told to destroy the greatest wizard of the age. It was a test he was meant to fail, and in failing he would bring shame or death upon his family. "You are being punished, Malfoys," Voldemort might as well have said, "and your son will carry your sins." The mission was not only revenge, but a twisted loyalty test. Voldemort wanted to see how far the Malfoys would go to redeem themselves. Would they grovel? Would they sacrifice their own child? The Dark Lord delighted in this game. He believed loyalty was proven not by words, but by blood. If Lucius had failed, then let his son's failure serve as a deeper proof of submission. It was a strategy as ancient as tyranny itself. Punish not the man, but his legacy. And yet the beauty of Voldemort's cruelty was how cloaked it was in the illusion of opportunity. To outsiders, it looked as though Draco had been honored. "The Dark Lord trusts me," Draco had boasted on the Hogwarts Express. But behind the arrogance lay a trembling boy. As the school year wore on, that facade began to crack. His eyes darkened. He grew paler. His magic flickered with desperation. "I have to do this," he said to moaning Myrtle, tears slipping down his face. "He'll kill me! He'll kill my family!" Draco's plan involved the Vanishing Cabinet, an ancient piece of magic even most adults wouldn't dare to manipulate. He repaired it slowly, obsessively, isolating himself from his friends, his schoolwork, and even from his once dismissive rival, Harry. Each step he took brought him closer to something he feared more than death: failure in the eyes of Voldemort. The cabinet was not just a magical object, it was his last hope. He used it to sneak Death Eaters into the school, believing it was his only chance. In truth, Voldemort had never expected him to get that far. And yet, Draco did get that far. When he finally disarmed Dumbledore atop the astronomy tower, wand trembling in his hand, he stood at the brink of immortality or annihilation. But he couldn't do it. "Draco," Dumbledore said gently, "you are not a killer." In that moment we saw the truth of Voldemort's miscalculation, or perhaps his calculation playing out exactly as planned. Voldemort didn't need Draco to kill, he only needed him to break. The tragedy was layered. Draco was not a loyal servant of the Dark Lord, he was a boy conscripted into a war he didn't choose. Voldemort's genius lay in forcing others to damn themselves in his name. And in Draco's case, he had orchestrated a situation where the boy's success or failure would both serve the Dark Lord's goals. If Draco failed, the Malfoys would be further disgraced. If he succeeded, Voldemort could parade the boy as a prodigy of death, proof that even the youth bent to his will. Narcissa, Draco's mother, understood this manipulation better than anyone. She didn't trust Voldemort. That's why she went to Snape and begged him to make the unbreakable vow, to protect Draco, to ensure the task was completed if Draco could not. It was a mother's desperation, but also an act of quiet rebellion. She was defying the narrative Voldemort had written. She would not allow her son to die for the sins of his father. Snape, ever the double agent, agreed to the vow, sealing his fate. Should it prove necessary, "You will kill him." Those words were not just a promise, they were a sentence. Snape, Dumbledore, Narcissa, and Draco had all become players in Voldemort's twisted play. But none of them followed the script. That is why the ending on the tower was not what Voldemort expected. Draco couldn't kill. Snape did it for him. And in doing so, Snape earned Voldemort's deeper trust, another move in a much larger game. It is tempting to believe Voldemort was short-sighted in choosing Draco, but that would underestimate his strategic cruelty. Voldemort chose Draco precisely because he was young, inexperienced, and emotionally vulnerable. He knew that failure was likely, but that was the point. Voldemort didn't want a perfect assassin. He wanted a sacrifice, a warning, a boy dangling over a cliff so the rest of the Death Eaters could see what disobedience led to. Consider the psychological warfare involved. By forcing Draco to carry this task, Voldemort isolated him from his peers. Even other Slytherins noticed. Pansy Parkinson no longer chattered beside him. Crabbe and Goyle followed orders, but not out of camaraderie. He was alone, haunted. Every attempt on Dumbledore's life, poisoned mead, cursed necklace, failed, deepening Draco's torment. He wasn't being trained, he was being broken. In many ways, Draco's journey paralleled that of another boy forced into impossible choices, Harry. Both were marked by prophecy, by expectations too heavy for their years. But where Harry had love, friendship, and choice, Draco had fear, isolation, and coercion. Voldemort's genius was that he created mirror images, boys shaped by destiny, but twisted one into a symbol of despair. The assignment also served as a chilling message to the other Death Eaters. None of you are safe. None of your families are beyond my reach. Even your children can become pawns in my war. Bellatrix may have relished the chaos, but others, like Narcissa, began to doubt. Voldemort didn't demand love, he didn't demand understanding, he demanded obedience purchased through terror. And still, even Voldemort could not anticipate the full consequences. By giving Draco the task, he inadvertently planted the seeds of the Malfoys' eventual betrayal. Narcissa's lie in the Forbidden Forest, telling Voldemort that Harry was dead, was born from this very cruelty. She chose her son over the Dark Lord. "Is Draco alive?" she had whispered to Harry, and when the answer was yes, she made her choice. Voldemort's manipulation had finally overreached. Thus, the mission wasn't just a test of Draco, it was a test of what people will do under pressure. Voldemort believed fear would forge loyalty, but it only built cracks. Draco's horror, Snape's vow, Narcissa's rebellion. All began on the day Voldemort handed a teenager a death sentence masked as a mission. "You have been told what to do," Voldemort had said. But not even he foresaw what that would truly unleash. Looking back, we see Voldemort not as a mere warlord, but as a master of psychological torture. He didn't need to swing a wand to cause suffering. He used hope, family, and duty as weapons sharper than any curse. Giving Draco the mission wasn't a miscalculation. It was a message written in blood. No one is beyond my reach, but he forgot that even pawns can refuse to move. In the end, Draco survived, but he was never the same. His pale face, shaking hands, and haunted eyes during the Battle of Hogwarts told a silent story. He was a boy who had stood at the edge of darkness and chosen not to fall. And for all Voldemort's power, he couldn't force Draco to become what he himself had once been, a boy who chose evil when afraid. So when fans ask, why would Voldemort give such a mission to a boy? The answer lies not in logic, but in cruelty. It was never about success. It was about fear, about domination, about spectacle. Voldemort wanted the world to see that he could make even children carry out death in his name. But he underestimated the strength of love, even among the Malfoys. And in that, his plan unraveled. Number 21. Did Death Eaters have access to forbidden magic? They walked in shadows, cloaked not just in black robes, but in knowledge most feared, most forbidden. The Death Eaters, Voldemort's most loyal, most terrifying followers, were not merely zealots of ideology. They were students of the dark. And they studied not from textbooks in candlelit classrooms, but from blood-stained tomes kept hidden for centuries, parchments that trembled with cursed ink, and rituals performed by moonlight over bones and ash. The average witch or wizard knew of the unforgivable curses, Imperius, Cruciatus, and the Killing Curse. These were not merely spells, they were weapons of domination, agony, and death. But while many flinched even at the mention of these curses, for the Death Eaters, they were second nature, tools wielded as effortlessly as a painter uses a brush. Bellatrix Lestrange once screamed with eyes wide in delight, "You need to mean it, Potter," as she instructed him in the reality of casting Cruciatus. She knew what it took. Not just wand movement, but the deep-rooted desire to cause pain. That was her domain. Yet the unforgivable curses were only the surface. Beneath that surface lay a deeper, darker magic, one that Hogwarts didn't teach, and the Ministry denied even existed in modern wizarding society. The Death Eaters, however, indulged in it freely. They had access to ancient grimoires, stolen relics, and blood-soaked rites older than Merlin. This was magic whispered about in scared tones, alchemy that involved living sacrifice, rituals that stitched souls to objects, enchantments that required a piece of your own sanity in exchange. Antonin Dolohov, for instance, cast a curse in the Department of Mysteries that silenced Hermione Granger and left her gravely injured, despite it being non-verbal and without a known counter-curse. It was not a recognized spell from standard dueling textbooks. Dolohov had mastered something rare, something violent, something banned. That was the true measure of a Death Eater, not just the ability to harm, but the willingness to dive into a kind of magic that twisted the caster as much as the target. And there was necromancy, the reanimation of the dead. Officially, the magical world declared such acts as unstable and unethical, but the Death Eaters danced dangerously close to that line. Inferi, soulless corpses reanimated by dark enchantments, were used during the war, especially in Voldemort's cave of protection. These beings weren't summoned by accident. Someone had to bind them, and while Voldemort himself was the master behind most of these creations, the knowledge was surely passed on to a few among his inner circle. How else did they navigate such creatures with confidence, unless they had played God themselves? Blood magic, too, was a sacred blasphemy in which Death Eaters bathed. Bellatrix again becomes the prime example. It was said she used the blood of her victims in her rituals, practices not taught at Durmstrang, nor buried in the restricted section at Hogwarts. During the torture of the Longbottoms, she was not simply seeking information, she was feeding a ritual, one that required prolonged suffering. "They'll suffer like they've never suffered before," she whispered, her voice thick with cruel promise. Her madness was not random, it was ritualized, structured. And what of the Malfoys? Lucius Malfoy, aristocrat and manipulator, held not just political sway but possession of powerful artifacts, one of which, the cursed diary of Tom Riddle, nearly destroyed Hogwarts. It wasn't just a Horcrux, it was a vessel of influence, a tool that possessed a child and opened the Chamber of Secrets. Lucius had it in his possession, wrapped neatly and slipped into the hands of a little girl. The spell work involved in creating such a piece is so complex, so vile, it fractures the soul. That knowledge, how to bind part of one's essence into an object, was something Voldemort taught himself, but may have whispered to those closest to him. Severus Snape, despite eventually turning from the cause, knew well the world of the Death Eaters. His own spells, Sectum Sempra for instance, were created during his school years, a curse so violent it sliced skin like invisible swords hidden in the margins of an old textbook. "For enemies," he had written. If Snape, a young wizard, could invent such a spell alone, imagine the kind of unrecorded magic shared in Death Eater circles. Magic born from cruelty, practiced in basements and behind wards, no ministry official dared to breach. Yaxley, a less remembered but deadly follower, specialized in infiltration spells, curses that affected behavior and perception. Under his influence, the Imperious Curse became almost elegant, seamless, untraceable. He worked his way into the Ministry of Magic not just through bribes or threats, but through mind control so subtle it passed unnoticed by the most skilled aurors. This wasn't merely charm work, this was dark psychology laced with magic, something deeper than what was available even in the most advanced textbooks. They forged wands from bones, used hair not only for polyjuice but for binding spells, and dealt with magical contracts signed in blood. These weren't fairy tales, they were practical tools. Death Eaters studied from pages ripped from the lost books of Salazar Slytherin, the vanished scrolls of Eastern Europe, and even the forbidden tablets from Nurmengard's ruins. They scavenged war zones and graveyards alike. They brewed potions not for healing, but for extracting truth through agony, or for breaking the minds of their enemies. One cannot ignore the transformations. Animagi, metamorphmagy, and polyjuice-induced mimicry are familiar to most, but the Death Eaters practiced unstable transformations, shifting flesh, not form. During the Battle of the Seven Potters, some reported seeing masked Death Eaters that took no damage from spells because they had altered their internal structures, an art close to self-mutilation through magic. These weren't illusions, they were real transformations, short-lived but devastating in battle. McNair, the executioner, was more than a brute. He was rumoured to possess a set of runes used for binding magical creatures, runes that predated Gringotts' vault seals. These symbols could be branded onto skin, forcing even dragons into momentary submission. And while the evidence was never proven, some claimed he used these runes on rebellious wizards, forcing compliance without the need for imperious, magical slavery disguised as control. Dolores Umbridge once said, "The Ministry has always considered certain branches of magic to be dangerous." She was right, though she said it for all the wrong reasons. The Ministry feared what it could not contain, and the Death Eaters thrived exactly there, outside containment. They passed knowledge through memory files, not letters. They trained in silence, in isolation, using simulacra of their enemies, casting until the fake bled and screamed. Their allegiance to Voldemort was not merely ideological, it was bound by arcane oaths. Some claimed that when they took the Dark Mark, it wasn't just a brand, it was a ritual. One that involved fire, blood, and the whispering of something that wasn't quite English. The mark burned not from distance, but from intention. When Voldemort summoned, the pain was immediate. That kind of link, magical, spiritual, and neural, required forbidden art. No basic protean charm could do such a thing. The Lestranges, husband and wife, were said to sleep in chambers surrounded by sigils carved into the walls, symbols from the early Druidic ages, long before Hogwarts. Rodolphus once carried a ring engraved with seven-eyed serpents, a known sigil of vision-enhancing enchantments. Some believed it allowed him to see through disillusionment or even witness future outcomes in battle. These weren't trinkets, they were armaments in the form of cursed jewelry. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how easily they used these magics, not with ceremony but with fluency. A Death Eater could cast a bone-shattering hex between sips of wine. They didn't fumble for incantations, they breathed them. When Alecto Caro taught at Hogwarts, she introduced students to punishments laced with old pain magic, detentions that didn't leave visible marks but made students tremble in their sleep for weeks. That was the essence of Death Eater sorcery, not just pain, but humiliation, fear, dominance, magic designed not only to destroy the body but the spirit. By the final war, it became clear the Death Eaters were not just soldiers. They were occultists. They weren't just followers of Voldemort. They were preservers of an ancient, darker tradition, one that he resurrected. The Forbidden Forest might have been dangerous for students, but the Death Eaters had maps of its inner regions, and some said Bellatrix kept a stone circle deep within, where she once summoned fire without wand or word. In the end, the magical world feared Death Eaters not because of their numbers, but because of their secrets. Their understanding of magic wasn't constrained by ethics. They knew spells that had no names, potions that brewed screams into the steam, and rituals that altered more than the body. They reshaped reality, if only for a moment. So when someone asks, did the Death Eaters have access to forbidden magic unavailable to others? The answer is not just yes. It is terrifyingly, resoundingly, absolutely yes. They didn't stumble into darkness, they built homes there. And in those homes, beneath floors etched in blood and candlelight, they wrote new spells for an old world and dared the rest of us to try and stop them. Number 22. Why did some Death Eaters return to Voldemort despite fear? When Voldemort returned in the graveyard on that cold, windless night, Not all came to him immediately. Some hid, some hesitated, but others returned without a moment's pause. It was not fear that moved them. It was belief. It was devotion. It was something deeper, darker, and older than mere terror. Bellatrix Lestrange stood tall before her master, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with fervent adoration. "Master, we are yours," she cried, her eyes gleaming like a zealot's. Bellatrix did not follow Voldemort because she feared death. She followed him because, to her, he was death, beautiful, powerful, and sacred. She once said, "The Dark Lord has, in the past, entrusted me with his most precious," and the tone she used when speaking about him held no hint of apprehension. She worshipped him. Her loyalty was born from a shared vision, from an intoxicating belief that purity of blood was sacred, and that Voldemort was the chosen prophet of that truth. Bellatrix's madness was not the result of fear, but of love, twisted, dangerous love. Lucius Malfoy, on the other hand, had once been a proud, elegant man, wealthy, refined, and respected in the darkest corners of wizarding society. After Voldemort's fall in 1981, Lucius carefully adjusted the mask he wore in public. He claimed to have been under the Imperius curse. He slithered his way back into high society, rubbing shoulders with ministry officials, funding school boards, and cultivating a reputation of innocence. But when the Dark Lord rose again, Lucius returned. He did not return out of terror. He returned because without Voldemort, Lucius was just a man with money, a pawn among bureaucrats. With Voldemort, he was power incarnate. He returned because the Dark Lord promised a world where men like him would no longer need to hide. Yet Lucius's return was not rewarded with glory. After the disastrous Department of Mysteries incident on Dickheat, where he failed to retrieve the prophecy, Voldemort's favor shifted. Lucius was punished, still he did not flee. That too speaks volumes, because by then there was no escape. Voldemort did not need to threaten him. The failure itself was punishment enough. Lucius needed to believe that he could rise again in the Dark Lord's eyes, the dream of redemption, the hope for restored favor. These were the chains that bound him tighter than any curse. Then there were those like Walden McNair, the executioner for the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. McNair had tasted blood long before Voldemort's return. He had wielded the axe above Buckbeak's head without hesitation. For him, returning to Voldemort was not about belief or redemption. It was an opportunity, a chance to hurt, to destroy, to bathe in the power of destruction that the Ministry could never legally allow. McNair served because cruelty thrilled him, because Voldemort allowed him to become the monster he had always been behind the mask of bureaucracy. Others returned for family. Take Narcissa Malfoy. She was never branded, never a true Death Eater, but she was bound by love. Her loyalty to Voldemort was lukewarm at best, yet she moved within his circle, lied for him, played the part. And when her son was chosen to kill Dumbledore, she did not run. She sought Severus Snape, begged him to protect her child. "You will swear it. You will make the unbreakable vow," she pleaded. Narcissa endured Voldemort's world because to disobey meant death, not for her, but for Draco. In the end, it was love, not fear, that tethered her to the Dark Lord's world. And what of Draco himself, a boy of 16, handed an impossible task, trembling before a destiny written by men far more cruel than he could comprehend? He was not a Death Eater out of ideology or passion. He was dragged into the storm by legacy, by pressure, by the invisible but immovable hand of Voldemort's will. "I haven't got any options," he shouted in the room of requirement, eyes wild, cornered by forces older than his life. Draco returned because he had to. Because being part of Voldemort's world was safer than standing alone in the wreckage of his family's broken honor. The Carrow twins, Alecto and Amicus, returned not just with willingness but with zeal. When they were placed at Hogwarts to enforce Voldemort's doctrine, they did so with grotesque joy. They tortured students, rewrote history, and turned the school into a prison. Their pleasure was too genuine, too enthusiastic, to be fear alone. They believed in blood supremacy. They believed in might over mercy. Voldemort did not need to force their hands. He had already twisted their hearts. Peter Pettigrew was different. He returned purely out of fear, not fear of Voldemort's wrath, but of the world without him. He was a rat in both body and soul, scurrying to the feet of power. After betraying the Potters, Peter had nowhere else to go. When Voldemort was nothing more than a spirit in the forest, it was Peter who helped him regain a body. "He would have killed me," Peter once said of Sirius Black. But what he did not say was this: Voldemort was the only master who needed him. And in being needed, Peter found the only sense of worth he ever had. Then there were the ones like Antonin Dolohov, silent, brutal, and precise. Dolohov tortured and murdered not because he had to, but because he was good at it. He was imprisoned in Azkaban after Voldemort's fall, but the Dementors did not drain his loyalty. When he escaped, he returned like a soldier, reunited with his general. There are no recorded quotes from Dolohov. He did not speak often, but his wand spoke volumes. He fought in the battle of the Department of Mysteries and later at Hogwarts. Cold, relentless, devoted. His return was the return of a weapon to its wielder. But perhaps most haunting were the whispers about the dark mark, the branding that burned on every Death Eater's arm. It was more than a symbol, it was a tether. When Voldemort touched it, they felt it. When he summoned, they were pulled. Some claimed they felt him in their dreams, that he spoke to them in whispers, haunting their minds, even when he was bodiless. "You have been called, and you have come," Voldemort said to the circle in the graveyard, and they came. Not all, but enough, because the mark was not just on their skin. It was etched into their souls. Rookwood, the former unspeakable from the Department of Mysteries, had access to secrets and codes. When Voldemort fell, Rookwood was imprisoned, but not forgotten. When he escaped, he brought with him knowledge no one else could. He did not return because of fear. He returned because Voldemort was the only one who understood the value of what he knew. In a world of blind politicians and cowardly bureaucrats, only the Dark Lord saw Rookwood as a visionary, not a traitor. Some, like Travers, whose name was linked to the murder of the Mackinnons, were fanatics in the truest sense. Travers returned to Voldemort's side not because he had been coerced, but because he had never stopped believing. Men like Travers wore their past like armor, and the return of the Dark Lord was not a threat. It was a resurrection. A second chance to finish what had once begun in blood and shadow. Mulciber, the master of the imperious curse, revelled in control. He had turned people into puppets with a flick of his wand. For him, Voldemort's return was the reopening of the stage. Fear had never stopped Mulciber. Boredom had. And with the Dark Lord rising again, Mulciber could once more command the theatre of chaos. And Snape. Oh, Snape. The double agent, the half-believer, the man of contradictions. He returned, but he never truly belonged. "He's a spy," said Sirius Black, "and a damn good one." Dumbledore trusted him, but Voldemort tolerated him. Snape's return was the greatest gamble. He served the Dark Lord, but only outwardly. Inside, he served Lily's memory. Yet he knew the price. He walked among the Death Eaters again, not from fear, not from belief, but from necessity. A man hiding his true self in plain sight. Yaxley, the Ministry infiltrator, found a home under Voldemort's rule. Power was easy to gain when your enemies were afraid. Yaxley wasn't driven by ideals, he was driven by order. Not the Ministry's version, but Voldemort's. A world where strength ruled and cunning prevailed. Yaxley was a man who understood structure, and Voldemort offered him a place at the top of a new one. Even Regulus Black Sirius's younger brother once bore the mark. He joined not out of fear, but out of youthful arrogance, the desire to make his family proud. But when he discovered the truth behind the Horcruxes, he died trying to stop Voldemort. His story was the rarest, a Death Eater who turned away, and in doing so proved that some followed Voldemort with pure hearts misled. Each Death Eater had their own reason. Some believed in the purity of blood, others in the promise of vengeance. Some clung to dreams of redemption, others craved destruction. Not all were cowards, not all were fools. Some were scholars, some were zealots, some were simply lost. But they came back, again and again, because Voldemort was more than a man. He was a storm, a vision, a voice in the dark. He offered identity to the hollow, purpose to the drifting, revenge to the broken, and though fear lingered like smoke, it was belief, raw, dangerous belief, that brought them back into the fold. Number 23. Why didn't Voldemort trust even his most loyal followers? Lord Voldemort, once Tom Riddle, was a man who demanded loyalty, yet trusted no one. This paradox was not just a quirk of his character, it was a fundamental aspect of his nature. He craved control, absolute and unyielding, and the idea of placing his fate in the hands of others was abhorrent to him. Even the most faithful Death Eaters, those who sacrificed, tortured, and killed in his name, were never truly trusted. He saw in each of them a potential traitor, a future disappointment, a weakness waiting to be exposed. The fear of betrayal haunted him like a shadow, ever present, whispering that trust was a luxury for the naive. And Voldemort was never naive. Lucius Malfoy, once the golden boy of pure-blood aristocracy, learned this the hard way. At the peak of Voldemort's power, Lucius was one of his most favored servants, entrusted with dangerous tasks, such as placing Tom Riddle's diary into the hands of a child. But after the diary was destroyed and Ginny Weasley saved, Voldemort's punishment was swift and merciless. He never forgave Lucius for the failure. "You lost me my servant, Lucius. I do not forget." That single line in The Half-Blood Prince froze Lucius more than any curse. It wasn't just about the diary, it was the implication that Voldemort saw every mistake as treason, every misstep as disloyalty. Lucius had served with devotion, but Voldemort viewed him no differently than a pawn that had outlived its usefulness. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most fanatically devoted of all the Death Eaters, fared little better. Her worship of the Dark Lord bordered on the religious. She would have died for him without hesitation. But even she was not beyond suspicion. When Voldemort learned that she had kept the prophecy's location from him, sharing it only with her husband and Barty Crouch Jr., he did not commend her caution. Instead, he questioned her judgment, implying that secrecy, even from him, was a form of betrayal. Bellatrix's madness hid the sting of his rebuke, but it was there. "I do not trust anyone, not even you, Bella." Those words, though not spoken in the book, lived between the lines, an unspoken law she obeyed, though it likely broke her heart. And then there was Severus Snape. The ultimate enigma, the double agent, the man who walked the knife's edge between loyalty and betrayal. Voldemort valued Snape's skills, his potions mastery, his cunning, and his access to Dumbledore. but he never trusted him. In the Deathly Hallows, Voldemort makes a telling remark, "Only I can live forever." This line, spoken before ordering Nagini to kill Snape, encapsulates his paranoia. Voldemort believed the Elder Wand belonged to Snape, and even in his final hour, Snape's loyalty earned him nothing. Voldemort needed the wand's allegiance, and if killing Snape was the price, then so be it. Years of service, murder, sacrifice. It meant nothing when the Dark Lord's ambition demanded blood. The roots of Voldemort's distrust stretch back to his childhood. Born in an orphanage, Tom Riddle grew up without love, family, or comfort. He learned early that people lie, hurt, and leave. No one came for him. No one loved him. That absence of affection hardened into a philosophy. Love is weakness, trust is dangerous, and power is the only constant. When Dumbledore visited young Tom and invited him to Hogwarts, the boy's first reaction was not gratitude, but suspicion. He hoarded information, stole from others, experimented with dark magic in secret. Even as a child, he sought domination, not connection. His control over the other orphans was not built on friendship, it was built on fear. This mindset followed him to Hogwarts. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore recounts Tom's preference for solitude and secrecy. He disliked company, preferred to operate alone, and showed a disturbing fascination with the dark arts. Tom created a small group of followers, precursors to the Death Eaters, but they were never friends, they were tools. He never revealed his true plans to them, never shared the knowledge of the Horcruxes, never gave them anything they could use against him. Even among allies, he remained a fortress. He believed that to trust was to risk, and Voldemort never gambled. Voldemort's paranoia was not without cause. His rise to power was built on fear and manipulation, and such foundations attract only those who hunger for power themselves. The Death Eaters served him, yes, but many did so out of ambition, not devotion. When he disappeared after his first fall, many of them quickly claimed to have been under the Imperious curse. They abandoned him. Betrayal confirmed every fear he ever had. Many of our oldest family friends claimed that they'd been bewitched, Lucius once said bitterly. Voldemort never forgot that. When he returned, he made it clear that he remembered who had truly searched for him and who had not. The Carrows, Crabbe, Goyle, Nott, even McNair, they were nothing more than tools to Voldemort. He doled out punishment and reward arbitrarily, never allowing anyone to grow too confident. This kept them in line, but it also bred resentment. Voldemort mistook fear for loyalty, and in doing so, he created a court of sycophants who trembled before him but did not love him. In the final battle, many of them fled once he fell. Only Bellatrix remained until the end, and even she died not defending him, but trying to strike down his enemies in rage. Perhaps the greatest irony of Voldemort's life was that he feared betrayal so deeply that he made it inevitable. His mistrust created an atmosphere in which true loyalty could not survive. When people are treated as expendable, they eventually behave as such. Even Wormtail, whose cowardice drove him to the Dark Lord, ultimately hesitated in the final moment. "You showed me mercy," he whispered to Harry in the dungeons, just before the Silver Hand, gifted by Voldemort, turned on him. It was Voldemort's own distrust, his own twisted magic, that killed Pettigrew. The lesson was cruel but clear. Voldemort's inability to trust destroyed even those who would have died for him. Dumbledore understood this flaw intimately. He once told Harry, "You are protected, in short, by your ability to love." That single statement drew the line between Voldemort and the rest of humanity. Love implies trust, and Voldemort rejected both. He believed trust made him weak, but in reality it left him isolated. Even his Horcruxes, meant to protect him, became symbols of his solitude. He split his soul not just to avoid death, but to ensure that no single betrayal could destroy him. It was an act of supreme mistrust in the world itself. Even Nagini, his beloved serpent, was not exempt from suspicion. In the Deathly Hallows, Voldemort keeps her encased in a protective bubble, hidden and guarded despite her years of loyal companionship. He talks to her, yes, but he does not confide in her. She is a servant, a weapon, and ultimately a vessel for his soul. Her death at the hands of Neville Longbottom was the final unraveling of Voldemort's illusion of control. Everything he had hoarded, hidden and guarded was undone, not by a cunning traitor, but by the courage of those who trusted one another. The tragedy of Voldemort lies not in his power, but in his emptiness. He could kill without remorse, command armies, and defy death, but he could not form a single, genuine human connection. That was his curse. His Death Eaters feared him, yes, but none mourned him. His reign ended not with a dramatic betrayal, but with the quiet collapse of a man who had no allies, no love, and no faith. In the end, Voldemort was defeated by the very things he despised: trust, friendship, and sacrifice. His final moments encapsulate everything. Standing in the ruins of Hogwarts, facing a boy he had tried to kill since infancy, Voldemort refused to believe that love could win. "There is no good and evil," he said to Harry in the Philosopher's Stone. "There is only power, and those too weak to seek it." But that power failed him. Harry did not fight alone. He had friends, mentors, a family forged by choice, not blood. Voldemort stood alone, and when his own spell rebounded upon him, no one wept, no one screamed. The silence that followed his fall was not mourning, it was relief. In that silence lies the truth. Voldemort never trusted anyone, and so in the end, no one stood by him. His empire of fear crumbled not from force, but from emptiness. And perhaps if Tom Riddle had known how to trust, even just once, his story might have ended differently. But for the boy who grew up alone, who chose domination over love, there was never any other ending. Number 24. What role did Death Eaters play in taking over the Ministry? The takeover of the Ministry of Magic was not announced with explosions or fanfare. It began with whispers, shadows, and fear that slithered like smoke through the hallways of power. Death Eaters didn't storm the gates. They slid in through cracks, through weaknesses in men's hearts. It was a coup without a war, and yet it left the magical world in ruin. One man stood in their way, Rufus Scrimgeour, the proud and lion-like minister. He had once told Harry, "These are dangerous times, and you need to be seen to be doing something." But in the end, no amount of public appearances or rousing speeches could stop what was coming for him. They started, as all good tyrants do, with influence. Pius Thicknesser, a name most didn't know before the war, suddenly found himself acting minister. He had once worked in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a dry bureaucrat with a mild temper. But he became something else entirely. A puppet. "He's been imperious," said Lupin grimly. "You can tell." And it was true. Thickness's eyes no longer held thought. His voice had the clipped emptiness of a man not in control of his own mind. The imperious curse made him a hollow shell, filled with the will of another, Lord Voldemort. From that foothold, the Death Eaters moved like poison. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was their first major conquest. Yaxley, one of the inner circle, walked through its halls with the cold assurance of a man who feared nothing. He did not need to sneak. He didn't hide. The Aurors, who remained loyal to the Ministry, found themselves outnumbered, overruled, and in some cases disappeared. The DMLE became a machine, churning out warrants, arrest orders, and execution sentences. Nobody dared question them. not if they wanted to see the next sunrise. In the Department of Mysteries, the Death Eaters found fertile ground for corruption. What they could not understand, they seized. What they could not seize, they destroyed. The unspeakables were forced into silence in the most literal sense. Some were fired, others fled. One, Broderick Bode, had once fallen victim to the imperious curse years before. Now his fate seemed prophetic. The department's knowledge, its secrets of time, death, and thought, fell into Voldemort's hands like sand through fingers. The Commission for the Registration of Muggle-borns was perhaps the darkest of all creations. Dolores Umbridge, once a simpering bureaucrat with a love for kittens and cruelty, rose to power again. Her office became the heart of the regime's ideology. "You are under investigation for the theft of magical power," she would purr, as children and mothers were dragged in chains before her desk. There was no mercy in her world, only bloodlines and punishment. The daily life of the wizarding world began to twist. Hogwarts, once a sanctuary, felt the chill of terror. Children whispered that the Ministry was watching. Owls were intercepted, letters censored, even portraits seemed to go silent. The trace was expanded, apparition licenses were harder to get, wands were registered, re-registered, examined. Fear was no longer the shadow at the door. It sat at the table. The press fell next. The Daily Prophet, once arrogant and gossipy, became an obedient dog. It barked only what it was told. Undesirable #1 Harry Potter blared its front page. Rita Skeeter's quill went quiet. Xenophilius Lovegood tried to resist publishing truth in the Quibbler, but his daughter paid the price. "They took Luna," he whispered when Harry arrived at his home. "They took my Luna." Kingsley Shacklebolt, once a visible aura, went underground. He worked from the shadows now, warning those who needed it. He sent coded messages, he smuggled information through enchanted coins. "The Ministry has fallen," his voice boomed through Potterwatch. "Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming. Be prepared." It wasn't a speech, it was a prophecy. The Death Eaters didn't just want control, they wanted transformation, they wanted to reshape the world. They created a new kind of order, not through battles, but through legislation and terror. People didn't see the Ministry as a government anymore, they saw it as a prison, one that watched, judged, and consumed. Runcorn, a large man with a blunt face, was one of their lesser tools. He rose in the bureaucracy because he was useful, not loyal. Harry wore his face once under Polyjuice Potion and saw the way people stepped aside. "Morning, Albert," they'd say, eyes averted. Fear was power. And fear made men like Runcorn kings. Even Arthur Weasley was not safe. He was watched, questioned, and nearly fired. His sons were hunted. His home was not protected by laws anymore, only by enchantments and love. Molly Weasley kept the kitchen warm, but her hands shook more than they used to. Scrimgeour's death was symbolic. They didn't just kill him, they broke him. He was tortured, questioned, and left to rot. And still he didn't betray Harry. "He never told them," said Lupin. "He died like a Gryffindor." His body was discarded, his legacy erased. And in his place stood Thickness, a man with no will, reciting words that were not his own. The atrium of the Ministry changed. The golden fountain of magical cooperation was torn down. In its place rose a statue, a grotesque monument showing Muggles being crushed beneath a wizard's throne. "Magic is might," it declared. A lie carved in stone. Visitors no longer looked up in wonder. They walked quickly, heads down, past security checkpoints and armed guards. The Wizengamot was no longer a council of elders. It became a stage. Trials were performances now. Evidence didn't matter, only blood status. Those with Muggle parents were guilty by default. Wands were snapped, memories altered, homes confiscated. "They came at night," said one old wizard. "They said my wife had Muggle cousins. I never saw her again." Behind it all was Voldemort, but he was not seen. Not often. He let his generals carry out his will. Bellatrix Lestrange, drunk on power, laughed during raids. Yaxley planned strategy. Travers oversaw torture. Even Fenrir Greyback was given permission to hunt freely. "He likes the taste of children," one man whispered in Nocturne Alley. The Order of the Phoenix became ghosts. They didn't meet in Grimmauld Place anymore. Too dangerous, too obvious. They met in barns, in cellars, in enchanted forests. They moved silently, helping those who were fleeing. They carried passwords instead of papers. Names were whispered, not spoken. The Ministry's fall wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unravelling, like a tapestry being pulled thread by thread. And when it was gone, people couldn't even remember when it had still been whole. And yet through all this, resistance burned, tiny, stubborn and bright, like a candle in a storm. Harry, Ron and Hermione were out there, not fighting battles but igniting sparks, destroying Horcruxes, breaking the spell of fear. One by one, they turned the tide, but even they felt the weight of what had been lost. "The Ministry has gone," said Hermione quietly. "They control everything." And for a moment, even Harry was silent, because she was right. This wasn't just a coup. It was the death of truth, the death of justice. In the end, the Ministry became Voldemort's mask. It smiled with Umbridge's teeth. It signed documents with Thickness's hand. But behind it all was the same evil, cold, patient, and hungry. When the war was over and Voldemort fell, the Ministry was reclaimed. But it would never be the same. People remembered. The walls whispered the names of the vanished, and every new law was read with caution, because they had seen what could happen when evil wore a suit and carried a wand. The Death Eaters didn't just take over a government, they corrupted an idea, and that was perhaps their greatest crime. Number 25. Do Death Eaters still exist after Voldemort's death? There were whispers even after the smoke cleared at Hogwarts, after the rubble was brushed from the great stone steps and the banners of mourning were raised in honor of the dead. Lord Voldemort had fallen. The Dark Lord was gone. But evil, true evil, never truly vanishes. It recedes like fog before the sun, only to return when the light fades. Many Death Eaters perished that night. Bellatrix Lestrange was struck down by Molly Weasley, a duel that sent shockwaves through the ranks of Voldemort's followers. Lucius Malfoy fled from the battlefield, not in defiance, but in fear. Narcissa, already fractured from the war, clutched Draco as if the boy's skin might shatter. And yet even as the Death Eater mark faded into dull ink on their skin, the ideology did not. Years later, in a crumbling manor house in Wiltshire, a young boy stumbled upon a sealed study. The place had not been opened since the war. It belonged to Antonin Dolohov, one of Voldemort's most ruthless followers. Dolohov had died in the final battle, torn apart by curses after taking down 3 auras. The boy found a journal wrapped in dragon hide. Inside, the words bled with hatred. The cause is not dead, it merely waits. Kingsley Shacklebolt, newly appointed Minister for Magic, declared in his first public address, "There are no more Death Eaters, there is no more war." The people cheered, desperate to believe. But Harry Potter stood silent in the back of the hall, arms crossed, eyes shadowed. He knew better. He had lived with prophecy and watched friends die. Evil does not end with the death of its figurehead. Azkaban, under Kingsley's new rule, was no longer guarded by Dementors. The prisoners, including the remaining Death Eaters, were treated more humanely. Yet that did not stop the escape of Thorfinn Roll 3 years after the war. Disguised under Polyjuice, he vanished into the north, leaving behind a single message carved into the wall. The serpent sleeps, but it dreams. Hermione Granger, then deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, reviewed Roll's case herself. She read every file, every testimony. In one parchment, she found a note scribbled in the margin by a junior aura. Rumours of gatherings in the Highlands. Unconfirmed sightings of ex-Death Eaters, believers. Neville Longbottom, who had cut the head from Nagini and helped shatter Voldemort's final Horcrux, once received a letter while teaching at Hogwarts. No name, no return address, just 5 words. You forgot the broken ones. He burned the letter in the fireplace, but the words remained etched in his mind. Years passed. The wizarding world rebuilt. The scars faded. Diagon Alley thrived again. Laughter returned to the 3 broomsticks, and the Ministry boasted new policies of inclusion and reform. But beneath the cobblestones, in the forgotten corners of Nocturne Alley, something stirred. A new wandmaker, a reclusive man with silver eyes and a nervous twitch, began crafting wands with dragonbone cores, an illegal practice. When questioned, he replied, "The old ways will rise again." Goyle was arrested once in 2010, suspected of cursing a Muggle-born shopkeeper in Bristol. He was released for lack of evidence, but the Daily Prophet ran the headline anyway. Ex-Death Eater or loyal patriot? Opinions were split. Some feared the past, others mourned it. The line blurred with time. Astoria Greengrass, wife of Draco Malfoy, tried to keep their family far from politics, but whispers grew around their son, Scorpius. Whispers about legacy, about bloodlines, about a mark that never truly disappeared. Draco, weary and grey, once told Harry in a quiet meeting at the Ministry, "We tried to forget, but our fathers wrote too deep." Not all Death Eaters had joined out of belief. Some joined from fear. Some, like Severus Snape, lived double lives. Others, like Regulus Black, died trying to undo their mistake. But among them were zealots, true believers. Those who called Voldemort not just a leader, but a messiah. In 2015, a cottage in Eastern Europe was raided by international auras. Inside, they found symbols not seen since the days of the First War, the skull and snake, the inverted triangle carved into stone, and a half-finished statue of Voldemort made from obsidian. On the walls were words painted in blood-red ink. "The Dark Lord returns in flesh or flame." No name was attached to the place, but magical signatures were found, unfamiliar but powerful. One belonged to a young witch with no recorded background, but whose magic tested off the charts. She had vanished into the mountains months before. A letter to her sister had said only, "I go where the blood calls." Theodore Nott was caught smuggling cursed objects in 2020. Among them was a silver ring engraved with the name Caro. When questioned, Nott said he had bought the items from a man in Bulgaria who spoke of the New Covenant, a name never seen before in magical records, but eerily close to Voldemort's obsession with pureblood destiny. Ron Weasley, who now headed the Department of Magical Games and Sports, joked once in an interview, "If I see another snake tattoo, I'm going to scream." But his smile faded when the interviewer asked about the rumours of Death Eater resurgence. "They're not an army," Ron said, eyes hardening. "Not anymore. But maybe they don't need to be." Harry, meanwhile, never stopped watching. He walked the alleyways of the wizarding world like a soldier long after the war. He kept a notebook. Inside were names, sightings, dreams. He recorded each one meticulously. Ginny once asked him why he couldn't let it go. He looked at her and said, "Because I saw what it looks like when we ignore the signs." In 2022, a boy in Durmstrang claimed he was descended from Dolohov. He showed classmates a wand with a carved serpent hilt and spoke of old power. When questioned by staff, he denied everything. But his dormitory was later found scorched, his mattress burned to ash, and a message scratched into the wall. "He will rise through me." Minerva McGonagall, aged and retired, once said in a rare public address, "We cannot defeat darkness if we pretend it never existed." She warned against complacency, against rewriting the war into myth. "Do not forget," she said, "do not sleep." In the Forbidden Forest, centaurs spoke of omens. The stars, they claimed, had darkened. One centaur, Firenze, visited the ministry to warn them. "A serpent coils again," he whispered, "but this one wears a new skin." The Death Eaters may not gather under one banner anymore. The dark mark does not blaze across the sky, but there are still those who believe, those who dream of a world purged of what they call impurities. They whisper the name Voldemort not in fear, but in reverence. In a small shop in Albania, a girl asked to see the restricted tomes. The shopkeeper refused. The girl smiled, placed a galleon on the table, and said, "My father taught me the old ways." The shopkeeper, trembling, handed her a book, bound in human skin. She disappeared before sunrise, and yet, despite it all, hope remains. For every mark burned into the sky, there are 10 more stars that shine. But vigilance is not optional. Evil wears new faces. It speaks with different voices, but its message is always the same. In his memoirs, Harry wrote, "Voldemort died, but hatred did not. The battle ended, but the war never truly does. We win by remembering, by protecting, and by standing between the light and the shadow." Today, in the deepest corridors of the Department of Mysteries, a door remains sealed. Behind it, some say, lies the last secret of the Death Eaters, a spell not of death, but of return. Others claim it's empty, that it was always just a room of silence. But every now and then a whisper leaks through the cracks, a whisper that sounds suspiciously like a hiss. The last known sighting of a confirmed Death Eater occurred just 2 years ago in the ruins of a castle once used as a sanctuary by Grindelwald's followers. A hooded figure stood before a fire, speaking to an unseen crowd. Witnesses fled, no names were given, but etched into the stones of that place, scorched and fresh, was the symbol of the Dark Mark. Subtler now, but unmistakable. So do Death Eaters still exist, perhaps not in name, perhaps not in number, but as long as the memory of power remains alluring, as long as wizards and witches seek dominion over others, the ideology endures. Voldemort was a man, but he was also an idea. And ideas, especially dangerous ones, have a way of surviving their creators. And perhaps one day, when the world grows quiet and the guards grow tired, the mark will pulse again, not on skin but in hearts. Hidden, waiting, dreaming, number 26, who remained dangerous even without Voldemort. In the dim corridors of magical history, the name Death Eater evokes immediate fear. They were the followers of Lord Voldemort, loyal to his vision of blood purity and domination. But not all of them simply followed. Some of them carved their own legend in terror, independent of their master's will. These individuals were not merely pawns, they were monsters in their own right. And even after the fall of Voldemort, the threat they posed never truly vanished. Antonin Dolohov was one such figure, a name whispered in the ranks of the Order of the Phoenix with fear and fury. Long before the rise of Voldemort, Dolohov had already made himself known as a ruthless and strategic duelist. He didn't require inspiration from the Dark Lord. Violence was in his blood. In the First Wizarding War, Dolohov was responsible for the deaths of Gideon and Fabian Prewett, 2 of the Order's fiercest fighters and brothers to Molly Weasley. It is said they died only after a brutal struggle, giving everything they had, but Dolohov's sheer power overwhelmed them. Moody once remarked, "They died like heroes, and it took 5 Death Eaters to bring them down. Dolohov was one of them." What made Dolohov particularly dangerous was not just his strength, but his terrifying precision. He employed a silent, wordless curse so lethal that it left no time for counterspells. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Harry and his friends faced Dolohov in the Department of Mysteries, he nearly killed Hermione. A streak of purple flame passed right across Hermione's chest. She gave a tiny, "Oh!" as though of surprise, and then crumpled on the floor where she lay motionless. That was Dolohov's signature. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it was clean and final. What's chilling is that Dolohov, after being imprisoned in Azkaban for his crimes, didn't break. He wasn't one of those who lost their minds to the Dementors. When he escaped during the mass breakout in 1996, he was sharper, hungrier, and just as committed to destruction as ever. Unlike some Death Eaters who needed Voldemort's orders to act, Dolohov moved with independent purpose. When paired with Roll, he stalked Harry, Ron, and Hermione during their escape from the Ministry. He didn't need a leader. The war was in his bones. Then there were the Carrows, Alecto and Amicus, siblings soaked in cruelty. During the brief but devastating takeover of Hogwarts, these two were put in charge of enforcing Voldemort's twisted ideology. But they went beyond enforcement. They delighted in it. Amicus was given the post of Dark Arts Professor. Not defense against the Dark Arts, mind you, because under his regime there was no defense, only submission and suffering. He turned a place of learning into a theatre of punishment. The Carrows introduced punishments where students who defied the new order were tortured by other students. Neville Longbottom, who became an underground resistance leader in those dark days, said they used the Cruciatus curse on kids who got things wrong. Me, Ginny, and Luna, we tried to stop them, but it only got worse. Alecto, who taught Muggle studies, restructured the entire course to spread hatred and lies. She described Muggles as filthy, lawless animals. Her lectures weren't lessons, they were indoctrinations. It's important to understand that Alecto and Amicus weren't soldiers. They weren't fighting battles. They weren't even hunting down enemies. They were educators wielding cruelty as a daily tool. And what makes this especially chilling is that they did it without constant oversight. Voldemort was rarely in Hogwarts. He didn't need to be. The Carrows, left to their own devices, enacted terror simply because they wanted to. That is the essence of true danger, when evil doesn't require permission. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most notorious of all Death Eaters, exemplified this unhinged devotion to destruction. Her crimes were legendary even before the Second Wizarding War. She tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom into madness, not to extract information, but out of sheer delight. "The Longbottoms were auras," said Sirius Black. "They fought against Voldemort just as hard as my brother did, and Bellatrix, she tortured them beyond recognition." What's particularly terrifying about Bellatrix is that she was already wreaking havoc when Voldemort had disappeared. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She believed the Dark Lord would return, and until then she would carry his flame, through fire and blood. Even her fellow Death Eaters feared her unpredictability. During the mission to retrieve the prophecy, Bellatrix mocked Lucius Malfoy's caution. "You should be proud," she screamed wild-eyed. "If I had sons, I would be glad to give them to the service of the Dark Lord." In battle, she was unmatched. She killed Sirius Black with a single curse, laughing as he fell through the veil. It wasn't just murder, it was theatre. Bellatrix turned death into a performance. The truly unnerving truth about these Death Eaters is that Voldemort didn't need to command them to act. He merely needed to exist. They interpreted his vision and added their own cruelty, their own initiative, their own brand of evil. Take Fenrir Greyback, not technically a Death Eater, but a close ally to Voldemort. His loyalty was to bloodlust. Greyback was a werewolf, but unlike others of his kind who tried to control their curse, he embraced it. He made it his identity. He sought out children specifically to infect them, believing that the younger the werewolf, the more loyal they'd be to him. Remus Lupin once said, "He's the reason I am what I am." Greyback bit him as a child. Not during a full moon by accident, but deliberately, because Lupin's father had insulted him. Fenrir lived among muggles and wizards alike, waiting for the moon to rise. He attacked without cause. He wasn't interested in Voldemort's ideology. He simply saw the war as an opportunity to spread his plague, and that made him more dangerous than most, because he operated on instinct, not orders. There were also those like Augustus Rookwood, a former unspeakable-turned traitor. Rookwood didn't revel in chaos like Bellatrix or Dolohov. He was quieter, more strategic. He funneled sensitive information from the Department of Mysteries directly into Voldemort's hands. It was Rookwood who informed Voldemort about the prophecy concerning Harry Potter. His betrayal shook the Ministry, not just because of what he leaked, but because it proved that evil had embedded itself into the very heart of the system. In many ways, the silent operators like Rookwood were more dangerous than the flamboyant killers. They moved through bureaucracy undetected, corroding trust from within. And when Voldemort vanished, they didn't vanish with him. People like Rookwood simply waited. They adjusted. They knew another opportunity would come. And when the Second War began, they resumed their place without hesitation. Yaxley, another example, infiltrated the highest levels of the Ministry during the Second War. He wasn't flashy, but he was efficient. With cold calculation, he helped install the puppet regime that placed Pius Thicknesse as minister. Under Yaxley's influence, Muggleborns were hunted and imprisoned, forced to prove their blood status. In Deathly Hallows, Harry sees firsthand how the Ministry, once a symbol of order, had become a place of fear. "It's worse than Azkaban," said one Muggle-born witch. At least in Azkaban, they knew they were prisoners. Yaxley didn't need to duel, he didn't need to torture. He controlled the levers of power, and that made him deadly in an entirely different way. Another underappreciated name is Travers. Not much is written about him in the books, but we do know he was involved in some of the most heinous acts during Voldemort's regime. He took part in the murder of Marlene McKinnon and her entire family. The McKinnons were known to be brave, vocal opponents of Voldemort. The fact that Travers targeted not just her, but her family, shows a level of ruthlessness that goes beyond war. It was extermination, erasure. The loyalty of such men was never about belief, it was about opportunity. And when Voldemort fell, they didn't renounce their ways. They waited, they buried their wands, wore their masks of civility, and bided their time. When the Second Rise began, they didn't need persuasion. They were already prepared. Even Regulus Black, though he turned away in the end, was a Death Eater at one point. His defection is a rare story of redemption, but his early recruitment shows how deep the web reached. It wasn't just sociopaths and murderers. It was children, idealists, people seduced by grandeur. But for every Regulus who saw the light, there were dozens who never did. Dozens who stayed in the shadows, sharpening their spells and waiting for chaos to return. It is easy to think that Voldemort was the cause of all evil in that dark chapter of magical history. But the truth is more terrifying. Voldemort was the spark, yes, but the fire, the real fire, was kept alive by individuals who needed no spark at all. Dolohov, Bellatrix, the Carrows, Greyback, Yaxley. They didn't just follow a tyrant, they became tyrants in their own right. And so when the war was over, when the Dark Lord fell, the world was not entirely safe, because monsters like these do not vanish with their master. They linger, they evolve, and they wait. Number 29. Why did the Ministry ignore their return for so long? When Harry Potter stood in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, watching Lord Voldemort rise once more from a cauldron of dark magic, the world changed forever. But the Ministry of Magic did not. Instead, it chose denial, a convenient blindness born not merely of fear, but of political cowardice. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, stood as the symbol of that willful ignorance, prioritizing control and image over truth and safety. His refusal to acknowledge Voldemort's return, even when presented with the living proof in Harry, revealed a ministry more concerned with headlines than horror, more focused on reputation than reality. The first warning signs had already begun to ripple across the magical world. Bertha Jorkins, a ministry employee, had gone missing during a trip to Albania. Rumours surrounded her disappearance. She was not the type to vanish without notice, yet Fudge dismissed it as an accident, something unworthy of deeper inquiry. In truth, Jorkins had been lured and murdered by Voldemort himself, her memories torn apart in exchange for the secrets she carried. She had spoken of Barty Crouch Jr., long thought dead, who had escaped Azkaban and lived under his father's imperious curse. But Fudge did not want to know. Knowing would require action, and action could upset the public. Then came the Triwizard Tournament, a grotesque spectacle culminating in the most damning evidence imaginable, Harry returning with Cedric Diggory's lifeless body and a tail soaked in blood and terror. "He's back," Harry told Dumbledore, trembling. Dumbledore didn't hesitate. He turned to Fudge, demanding preparations for war, for reform, for truth. But Fudge, his hands gripping his bowler hat, as if it were a lifeline, merely blinked. "He's not back," he said. "He can't be." This denial was not born from innocence. Fudge had reasoned it out with all the cunning of a bureaucrat. If Voldemort had returned, what would that say about his leadership? How would the public react? Panic would ensue. The Wizengamot might lose confidence in him. Elections might be called. But if Voldemort had not returned, if it was merely the fevered tale of a boy traumatized by the death of a classmate, then nothing need change. Better to label Harry as confused and Dumbledore as senile than to confront the storm forming just beyond their shores. Voldemort has always understood weakness. He slipped through the cracks of this denial like poison through glass. The Death Eaters, long dormant, began to stir. Lucius Malfoy, respectable as ever, resumed his influence under the guise of legality. He donated to charities. He whispered to governors. He used his wealth not for attack, but for access. Others followed. Crabbe, Goyle, Knott, Avery. Names that had once struck fear now returned to polite society under cloaks of reformed civility. And all the while the ministry applauded itself for peace well maintained. Dolores Umbridge, perhaps the most chilling manifestation of the ministry's rot, exemplified this delusion. "You are lying," she spat at Harry in the Hogwarts Great Hall, her eyes cold and pink. "He who mustn't be named is not back." Her loyalty was not to truth, nor to the children she was meant to protect, but to the fiction that kept the ministry's house of cards intact. She became Fudge's hammer, used not against Death Eaters, but against dissent. Education decrees multiplied, students were silenced, truth was outlawed. Even when the ministry could no longer deny the whispers, when Dementors deserted Azkaban, when giants began to stir in the mountains, when the skies over London turned green with the dark mark, they clung to the illusion of control. "The ministry is monitoring the situation," they'd say, with smiles as hollow as a ghost's promise. But monitoring was not the same as confronting, and confrontation meant admitting they'd been wrong. It was Sirius Black who saw it most clearly. Speaking to Harry in the shadows of number 12, Grimmauld Place, he said, "Fudge is scared stiff of Dumbledore. You see, Dumbledore's stirred up a lot of fear. People think he's after Fudge's job." But Sirius understood the deeper truth. Fudge feared not Dumbledore as a man, but Dumbledore as a mirror. A man who would force the world to see what they did not want to see. The Order of the Phoenix reassembled in secret. Tonks, Kingsley, Moody, Lupin, they moved like shadows, watching, protecting, fighting battles the Ministry denied existed. Each attack Voldemort orchestrated, each disappearance, each cursed object, each manipulated death was brushed aside as coincidence. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, began to grow suspicious, but her integrity marked her for death. She was found dead in her home, with signs of a duel that had shaken the walls. The Ministry called it tragic. The Order called it war. Voldemort infiltrated not only the streets but the very structures of power. Pius Thickness, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, fell under the Imperious Curse. Through him, Voldemort gained influence without raising a wand. The enemy wore Ministry robes, carried Ministry badges, spoke Ministry lies. And yet Fudge still refused to believe. "These rumors are damaging," he declared, "and I shall not tolerate any talk of Dark Lords returning without solid evidence." But what counted as evidence? Was it Harry's scar, searing with pain in the night? Was it the mass breakout from Azkaban when 10 known Death Eaters, including Bellatrix Lestrange, vanished into the storm? Fudge called it a coincidence, a security lapse. He could not see the chains breaking in the darkness, only the headlines in the Prophet. The Daily Prophet itself became a weapon. It published smear campaigns against Harry and Dumbledore. Rita Skeeter, ever hungry for a headline, labelled Harry unstable. "The boy who lies," one headline screamed. Dumbledore's reputation began to crumble, and the Death Eaters moved with impunity, cloaked by the fog of misinformation. Then came the Department of Mysteries, a trap set by Voldemort, baited with the one thing he knew Harry would chase, Sirius Black. In the battle that followed, Harry, Hermione, Ron, Neville, Ginny, and Luna faced Death Eaters in open combat. And there, at last, in the shadows of the veil, Voldemort revealed himself. Fudge arrived moments later, breathless, stunned, and saw with his own eyes what he had denied for 2 years. "He's back," he whispered. It was too late. By then Voldemort had gathered strength, followers, knowledge. The Ministry had lost not only time, but the faith of the people. Dumbledore was reinstated, but the damage was irreversible. Fudge resigned. His failure became the lesson of a generation. That fear of fear is the most dangerous enemy of all. Rufus Scrimgeour, who followed, was a stronger leader in appearance, but still trapped by the need for control. He sought to use Harry as a symbol, a pawn for morale. But Harry, hardened by the lies of the past, refused. "I don't care what you do with the press," he said. "I care what you're doing to stop him." The irony, bitter as it was, lay in the Ministry's obsession with order. By clinging to the illusion of peace, they invited chaos. By silencing truth-tellers, they gave voice to darkness. Voldemort did not need to conquer the Ministry. He merely needed it to hesitate. And while the Ministry scrambled, Voldemort placed his pieces on the board. He controlled the press. He cursed the Muggle Prime Minister's advisers. He sowed terror in the streets. And when Scrimgeour, too, fell, and Pius Thickness became minister under the Imperious Curse, the final mask dropped. The Ministry fell not with a battle, but with a whisper. The Death Eaters did not need to fight. They were already inside. It was Kingsley Shacklebolt who helped rebuild what was left after Voldemort's fall. He understood that institutions must not serve power, but people, that truth must not bend to comfort. But for too long, the ministry had chosen the easier path, and the cost had been measured in blood. Even years later, students at Hogwarts whispered of that era with a mix of awe and sorrow. They read the accounts, they studied the mistakes. History is written by those who act, Professor McGonagall would say, and sometimes by those who refuse to. Harry never forgot. Not the battle in the ministry, not the graveyard, not the blank stare of a man in a bowler hat who chose ignorance over justice. He had watched his friends bleed while the leaders of their world debated headlines. And so in the years that followed, as new laws were passed and old wounds healed, the lesson remained clear. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it finds safety in the silence of those too afraid to speak. The ministry's failure was not simply a failure to act. It was a failure to believe, to listen, to trust those who had seen what they dared not imagine. And in that silence, Voldemort grew louder, stronger, until truth itself became the first casualty of war. Number 30. Are there Death Eaters outside Britain? Few people questioned how far Lord Voldemort's shadow truly extended. For most, the war seemed a British affair, a dark chapter confined within the hills and valleys of that small island. But the scars of the Dark Lord's reign run deeper than most realize. Beyond the stone halls of Hogwarts and the foggy alleys of Knockturn Alley, whispers of his name echoed across borders, crossing mountains, oceans, and languages. The Death Eaters may have worn their masks in Britain, but their ideology found fertile ground far beyond it. Igor Karkaroff, headmaster of Durmstrang, was the first glimpse. Introduced in The Goblet of Fire, Karkaroff was a former Death Eater who fled Britain to take refuge in the cold, brutal lands of Eastern Europe. His position at Durmstrang, a school notorious for teaching the dark arts rather than simply defending against them, speaks volumes. He was caught, but he turned in a whole lot of people in exchange for his own freedom, Moody, or Barty Crouch Jr., in disguise, told Harry. He named names, a coward. But more than that, a thread to something wider. If Karkaroff could find safety, even admiration in the north, what else was happening far from Dumbledore's gaze? Durmstrang itself has long been surrounded by suspicion. Located in an unknown part of northern or eastern Europe, its students often arrive cloaked in fur and wariness. The school does not hide its darker tendencies. As Hermione once mentioned with disapproval, Durmstrang doesn't admit Muggle-borns. And if that's their policy, how far is the leap to full-blown blood purity? Victor Krum, Durmstrang's Starseeker, seemed a kind-hearted young man. But even he was raised in an institution that respected power and did not shy from cruelty. Some former students of Durmstrang, like a Bulgarian wizard named Alexei Dragovich, have since been linked to fringe magical movements sympathetic to Voldemort's views. Dragovich, a contemporary of Krum, was later rumoured to have founded a group in the Carpathian region dedicated to the restoration of magical order, a vague but dangerous phrase that echoes the rhetoric of the Death Eaters. While never formally charged, Dragovich was questioned by the International Confederation of Wizards in 2011 after multiple magical attacks on Muggle settlements in Romania. Then there is the matter of Beauxbatons Academy. Unlike Durmstrang, Beauxbatons enjoys a reputation of elegance, refinement, and beauty, but even roses hide thorns. Madame Maxime, its formidable headmistress, denied any infiltration of dark sympathizers during the Second Wizarding War. Yet several of her predecessors were known for harsh views on bloodlines. A letter discovered in the archives of the French Ministry of Magic from 1942 describes Headmaster Armand Gillet's belief that Muggle blood corrupts the gift of magic, eerily similar to the ideology that fueled Voldemort's rise. It is no coincidence that Voldemort, during his first rise to power, sent envoys abroad. According to a little-known entry in Rita Skeeter's unauthorized biography, the Dark Lord Ascending, a man known only as Corvinus, operated in France and Italy as Voldemort's foreign agent. Fluent in multiple languages, Corvinus allegedly recruited young pure-bloods under the guise of dueling societies. One former member, who now lives in hiding in the Swiss Alps, described meetings where they spoke of a coming cleansing, not just of Britain, but of all wizarding lands. This chilling vision was shared in part by Gellert Grindelwald decades earlier. Though Grindelwald and Voldemort never met, they walked similar ideological paths. Grindelwald's slogan, "For the greater good," carried a chilling ambiguity that masked ethnic cleansing under philosophical garb. Voldemort perhaps refined that vision into something more openly cruel. But in places where Grindelwald's name still inspired awe, Voldemort's message fell on receptive ears. There are even rumors that after Voldemort's fall, some of Grindelwald's remaining supporters merged their causes with hidden Death Eater cells. Evidence also emerges from Latin America. In 1999, a wizard named Rafael Montenegro was arrested in Brazil for conducting illegal experiments on magical creatures. In his confiscated journals, investigators found references to the purity of ancient bloodlines and the European ideal of magical dominion. Montenegro had never stepped foot in Britain, yet he idolized Voldemort, referring to him as the last great visionary. Some of his notes hinted at encrypted letters from the Masked, a figure believed to be a fugitive Death Eater who fled Britain after the Battle of Hogwarts. Even in North America, where the magical community tends to be more diverse and secretive, there were incidents. MACUSA, the Magical Congress of the United States, has never fully declassified its 2001 report titled Operation Nightfall, but leaks suggest that several magical extremists with British accents were apprehended in New Orleans attempting to set up a cleansing circle. The operation ended with 3 arrests and a 4th suspect vanishing without trace, leaving behind only a silver mask and a broken wand. What is clear is that Voldemort's ideology did not die with him. Like embers smouldering under ash, his message found purchase in the hearts of the bitter, the vengeful, and the proud. In South Africa, a group calling themselves the Children of Morgana began circulating magical pamphlets in 2003, praising the great reformer of Albion and declaring a future where magical supremacy would be restored. While officially dismissed as harmless radicals, 2 members were later linked to an attack on a half-blood family in Cape Town. And then there is the legacy of Antonin Dolohov. A feared Death Eater, Dolohov was imprisoned for multiple murders during the First Wizarding War, but his story did not end at Azkaban. After his death in the Battle of Hogwarts, several of his personal journals vanished from the Ministry's evidence vault. Years later, excerpts appeared on an obscure wizarding forum hosted in Siberia, detailing plans for the continuation of the cause and the rise of the next serpent.